Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 13, Money and Banks. Before I get into the slideshow, I want to encourage everyone to watch the video that I created for this chapter. This is the video aside from the PowerPoint video. I pretty much cover all of Chapter 13 and some of Chapter 14 in that video, so I'm going to go very quickly through Chapter 13 here. I know many of you are used to PowerPoints through YouTube and enjoy that, so I want to still make this chapter available to you through YouTube, but I'm not going to say a whole lot in this one because I really want you to watch that video. It explains it wonderfully, but I will go over each slide very briefly, and there's a couple graphs at the end that aren't in that video that I want to highlight. So once again, I'm going to assume that you've already watched that video when viewing this PowerPoint. So if you haven't seen that video yet, please stop the PowerPoint or YouTube video, however you're watching this, go watch that video and come back because I'm going to make a lot of assumptions here that you have, you already know certain things, including this first slide, what is money? That's covered in the video, so I'm just going to let you read it here and move on. The money supply, once again, that's covered in the other video. It's a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a standard of value. Once again, the US dollar is the world reserve currency, so when we think of money supply and we think of US dollars, it is the best store of value, standard of value, and medium of exchange in the world, with the possible exception of gold. Modern concepts. This is where I talk about the fiat currency when we get into how most money is actually in the form of computer balances, things like that. That's what we're really talking about here with modern. Composition of the money supply. We have the M1 cash, which is cash and transaction accounts. The M1 that's the currency you hold. That is actual dollar bills, $100 bills, things like that. M2 is M1 plus savings accounts. This is really what we consider the money supply. When somebody said, what is the money supply? Typically they're referring to the M2 money supply. That is the amount you have in your bank balance plus like your money market and mutual funds and cash that you may have. That is the M2 money supply, and that is the number when from here on out when we say money supply, that's what we're talking about. You can see here what makes up the M1 and M2 money supplies. Economic importance of money, how much money is available, the size of the money supply. The more money that's out there, the bigger the larger the total amount of money in the world, the more expensive things will be. As the total number of dollars in the world increases, inflation will increase, and which of course affects aggregate demand. Creation of money. Once again, this is what the video focused on. Cash is printed, but the rest of it is created through fractional reserve banking, which is covered in the video, and we'll talk about it very briefly here. Money is created by banks making loans. When a bank makes a loan of $1 million, the bank does not have $1 million that they just transfer to your name. Typically they have $100,000 and they are allowed to create the other $900,000 out of thin air to give to you. This is fractional reserve. Banks are required to hold certain levels of reserves, required reserve ratio. That can change depending on the type of loan, what the current law is. It changes all the time. It's gone anywhere from 2 to 10%, depending on circumstances. So that's the amount of money the bank has to have for every dollar loaned out. Fractional reserves, this is that amount of money that they still have to have in the bank. And it is, so if a bank were to have excess fractional reserves, which we're going to talk about in a minute, if a bank were to have excess fractional reserves, that's the potential amount they can still loan out. Changes in the money supply. When a bank makes a loan, money's created. The borrower spends the money, the seller deposits it into the firm's bank account. Basically all this is saying is that there's now more money in the system. Whenever a loan is made, new money is in the system. That's why during the real estate boom, all this new money was being created. We had the low interest rates, so banks could borrow real cheap from the Fed and then use that money as the reserves for the new loans they were creating. And it was bumping up the money supply very quickly. So we were creating a money bubble as well as a housing bubble because it was so easy to create new money. The money multiplier is the amount of deposited dollars that the banking system can create from $1 of excess reserves. So that's how much, so if a bank has $1 in reserves, how much more money can they create from that $1? The potential of the money multiplier to create loans is summarized in the equation. If the required reserve ratio is 20%, which is really high, the money multiplier is 5. An initial deposit of $100 has $80 of excess reserves and potentially can create $400 of new deposits. Typically, the money multiplier is much closer to 9 as a rule of thumb. Excess reserves and lending power. If the bank has no excess reserves, it can make no more loans. The bank can't make loans, and this is what happened when the credit crunch first hit. Banks didn't have any money to loan out. That's why it was very difficult to get a loan. And then the money started flooding in. Each bank may lend an amount equal to its excess reserves and no more. The entire banking system can increase the volume of loans by the amount of excess reserves multiplied by the money multiplier. So if the money multiplier is 9 and the number of excess reserves is 1 million, the amount of money in the system can be increased by 9 million. Banks perform 2 essential functions for the macroeconomy. They transfer money from savers to spenders by lending funds. The bank system creates additional money by making loans in excess of required reserves, and they are responsible for when there's changes in the money supply, it alters spending behavior. So by increasing the money supply, it increases aggregate demand. Constraints on deposit creation. If people prefer to hold on to cash, then there's fewer deposits, which means and the deposits become the reserves, so there's less money they can lend. If banks are reluctant to take risks in lending, they won't lend out all their excess reserves, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Willingness to borrow. If people don't want to borrow, the banks have no loans to make, and which rarely happens. And regulation. The Fed may step in and change the rules at any time. So here's the M2 money supply as of 2013. So we're a little over $10 trillion total money supply. But what's really scary is you look back, and as of the early 80s, the total number of dollars was about 1.6 trillion. Now we're over 10 trillion. It's a tremendous increase in the money supply. We have, if you just look since 2009, we've gone from the high 7s to we've created over $3 trillion out of thin air in just the last couple years. Now here's the one that I wanted to talk about. I mentioned this in the video, but the numbers have changed in the very short time since that video has been made to where I'm recording this. This is the total excess reserves of banks. And you can see from 1959, I believe, when they started keeping track of this sort of thing, up until 2008, 2009, banks lent out every penny they could. Every penny they could. They always just wanted to lend everything out. And then the government started pumping money into the banks in 2009, and the banks said, whoa, wait a minute, we can't lend out this much. It would be crazy because we would get massive inflation. Things that could be worth, could cost, I should say, 5 or 10 times as much as they do now if we put this much money into the system. So, because remember the money multiplier effect when we're looking at this. And you can see how quickly the money supply increases. The government is trying to increase the amount of dollars in circulation, and the banks are lending some money out, but not that much compared to what the government would like them to lend out. And when I recorded the other video, this was at about 1.5 trillion. And now you can see it's almost at 1.8 trillion. It's increased dramatically, that last little line there at the end, because banks are continuing to hold on, and the banks are protecting us as consumers and the value of our dollars. Because if you had a large savings, and if it was, say, $1 million, and the banks were to lend all this out and dilute the money supply to this degree, that $1 million could be worth, the value of it could drop to 20% of it. It could buy 20% of what it currently could now. It could be dramatic. Or at one point you could retire on $1 million. Well, now if the banks were to lend out all this money, there's the very realistic possibility you would only be 20% of your way to retirement. So the banks are protecting us. A few other things is that there's also the assumption that people are out there waiting to take out loans on all this money. There's also not a tremendous willingness of people to go take out the loans. There's not enough things to buy with all this money that could be created. So the government's intention of trying to increase the money supply through this method, with the banks saying no, with people not willing to borrow this much money, it's really proven to not be as effective as was originally planned and was originally thought.